taking questions from you. And I would, just before we start, I would firstly like to recognise the fact my non-Africanness and whiteness and the privilege in hosting this panel today, and appreciate the participation of all of our speakers taking part in their very, very busy schedules. As I just mentioned, one of our panellists is coming after they've taken the floor in an intervention. So it is a very busy day and we very much appreciate it. So just to give an overall introduction for our event. So Africa, as you know, is on the front line of the crises for climate and nature, while actively also delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. Achieving a just, rights-based, equitable transition to a healthy, resilient and carbon-neutral future across Africa requires significant multilateral collaboration across the public and private sectors, with African policymakers, financiers, business leaders and civil society involved throughout the journey. At the heart of Africa's race to sustainable development is energy. More than 600 million people in Africa still lack basic access to affordable, reliable and clean energy. Additionally, we know that 1.2 billion people globally, about 1 in 7, lack access to cooling, which is crucial to our food security, medical supplies, livelihoods and the prevention of heat-related deaths, according to a recent support by Sustainable Energy for All. It is clear that transformative action is needed to deliver on the adaptation we need and renewable energy transformation that protects Africa's unique wildlife. So Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents in the world to climate change. On the top of Africa's priority list is also to deal with the climate impacts through impactful adaptation interventions together with the just transition to renewable energy. Our rising temperatures, extreme weather, droughts and floods significantly impact Africa's natural resources, ecosystems, biodiversity, livelihoods, infrastructure, economic development and general health and well-being of the population. Recent IPCC AR6 report highlights alarming trends for Africa where more tangible actions are needed. African biodiversity loss is projected to be widespread and escalating with every 0.5 degrees increase above present-day global temperatures. Above 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming, half of the assessed species are projected to lose over 30% of their population or area of suitable habitat, with 18% of species assessed at risk of extinction, and over 90% of East African coral reefs are projected to be severely degraded by bleaching. Fisheries catch are projected to drop to up to 40%, and over 17 million Africans could be forced to migrate due to changes in food and water security. The reality of nature loss driven by climate change is critical for people and biodiversity. Without action, the world will see an estimated $10 trillion wiped off the global economy over the next 30 years, with developing countries and regions such as Africa particularly affected. From this, it is clear that having this panel discussion here during the Bonn SB 56 session is critical, as key stakeholders and decision makers from across the world have come together from Africa in particular and are gathered to share strategic reflections on the gaps to unlock and the priorities to secure and build impactful nature-based solutions for climate discourse in Africa. It is clear that we must foster collaboration across the public, private, finance and civil society sectors in the run-up to Africa's COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November to deliver on the ambitious outcomes for climate, nature and people. In this session, we hope to, 1, raise awareness on the urgency to address climate change impacts and risks to secure a better future for nature and people in Africa. 2, share insights and perspectives from panelists and attendees on a transformative climate adaptation, nature and energy transformation agenda in terms of knowledge, implementation, policy and regulatory framework, and the finance and relative efforts that are needed. and identify what bold commitments should be taken at COP27, being an African COP. And I know we're all really looking forward to that. So first up, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So over here we have Amy Fraenkel. So Ms. Fraenkel has over 30 years of experience in international environment law and policy. She has joined the CMS, the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, after working for 6 years at the Secretariat of the CBD in Canada. Part of the senior management, she led the Division on Mainstreaming, Cooperation and Outreach. She's also served for 6 years as the Director of the UNEP Regional Office for North Africa in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the United Nations, Ms. Fraenkel was the Senior Counsel of the Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries and Coast Guard Subcommittee of the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation, working on legislation related to climate change, fisheries, endangered species, ocean and coastal ecosystems, and maritime issues. Ms. Fraenkel also worked as a senior policy advisor in the Office of International Affairs within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and in private law for 7 years. Ms. Fraenkel holds a Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School and is a graduate of Grinnell College. So thank you, Amy, for joining us today. It's a real pleasure. So our next speaker, we have Khaled Nobif, our Executive Director from Nature Conservation Egypt, or NCE. Khaled has worked as a natural resources manager at several governmental and non-governmental institutions in Egypt for more than 10 years. He has also joined a few international projects and initiatives that targeted linking natural and cultural heritage in Africa in theoretical and practical frameworks. He is also a visitor researcher in behavioral ecology group in Muangi University. He's studying migration ecology in North Africa in particular. Khaled now leads NCE since 2020. NCE is the Egyptian BirdLife partner and perhaps the most active NGO working on nature conservation at the national level. NCE's work covers a wide range of species and land conservation in Egypt, but also has very recognizable efforts in awareness raising and advocacy work. NCE is highly involved in the risk assessment of renewable energy infrastructure and wildlife, especially along the Red Sea, particularly migratory bird collision with power lines and landscape and habitat degradation due to the construction of renewable energy-related facilities and infrastructure. And finally, down the end there, we have Charles Muangi, who's the Acting Director of Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance, or PACJA. We're very grateful to have Charles join us today. Charles is serving as the acting director. He's a climate change specialist with over 15 years experience in designing and implementing climate change and community-based development programs in Africa. Currently, Charles is coordinating through 51 countries through the PACJA platforms in those countries. The PACJA Alliance is a consortium of more than 1,000 organizations from 48 African countries and brings together a diverse membership from faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, trusts, foundations, indigenous communities, farmers and pastoralist groups with a shared vision to advance a people-centered, rights-based, equitable, just and inclusive approach to the climate response. So as you can see, we've got a very esteemed panel joining us today, and I'm looking forward to having a dynamic conversation going forward. So first up, Amy, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. So Amy, the nature, climate and energy crises have never been felt more widely. The CMS Energy Task Force is well positioned to help address these synergies through its multi-stakeholder base. What do you see as the future direction of the CMS and its Energy Task Force in helping to ensure synergies relating to sustainable development goals on energy, climate and people?
Thank you very much, and thanks for all of you for being here, to the organizers of this event, my fellow panelists. So first, let me just say one or two words about the Convention on Migratory Species for those that are not so familiar with us. CMS, as we're called, we're actually based here in Bonn, along with the Climate Change Secretariat and other parts of the UN. We're an environmental treaty of the United Nations, and we're the only global treaty that focuses on migratory species and their habitats. CMS provides essentially the basis for governments to come together, whether at the transboundary, regional, or global level, to address species that are in the range, across the range of the species migratory pathways. So it's fairly unique. Now, addressing climate change is absolutely vital for protecting migratory species and their habitats. Migratory species depend on very particular types of habitat for the different parts of their life cycle. So they need different areas for breeding, for feeding, and if they're birds in particular, for stopover sites. But there's been recent science that shows that climate change is changing the timing of migrations and also having impacts on habitat, which can lead essentially to a mismatch. So if you have birds, for example, setting off on a long journey, they're expecting to come to a place that has certain features, ecological features, but if they're going earlier, their prey might not be there, the habitat might be degraded, and this will have a direct impact on migratory species. The recent IPCC report, actually that Rhiannon noted on climate change impacts, also found that climate change is impacting all types of ecosystems around the world, as well as species. So this is very, very much on the front lines for us. CMS is currently working under one of our mandates on climate change to look at the impacts of climate change on migratory species and habitats and the implications for conservation and management approaches, because we can't rely anymore on the old models, for example, on place-based management if the places are changing. So we're really looking at ideas for dynamic management and the concept of ecological connectivity across landscapes. So it's not a fixed set of protected areas necessarily, but a more dynamic approach. Now, turning to renewable energy, the parties of CMS also have a mandate to address threats to CMS species, and those include threats from energy infrastructure. Poorly located wind turbines and power lines can impact migratory birds and bats in particular by causing habitat loss and fragmentation from the development, collisions with the blades, electrocution, and deviation of migratory routes, which can exhaust the species and lead to mortality. There are specific CMS Conference of the Party resolutions that call for attention to this issue, in particular on renewable energy and power lines. But in addition, the convention itself, the original text of the CMS convention, which was adopted in '79, actually has an obligation. If there are species that are listed on our Appendix 1, which is the more endangered species, they are not allowed to be taken out of the wild by parties. But in addition, parties have an obligation to prevent, remove, compensate for, or minimize the adverse effects of activities or obstacles that seriously impede or prevent the migration of species. So in other words, wind turbines could interrupt the migration routes of these species. Now what's interesting is that provision is now part of a new mechanism for CMS, which is a legal mechanism. It's called a review mechanism where parties, the Secretariat, NGOs and others can actually call attention to a situation where they think that is not being followed, and there can be a case developed, in fact, on that basis. So we're talking about a real concrete compliance mechanism related to energy infrastructure. Now, interestingly, over 70% of CMS parties that reported on developments at our last COP identified renewable energy technologies and infrastructure as a pressure to migratory species in their countries. At the same time, we know we need more energy in Africa and other parts of the world, and there's an increased demand for renewable energy, which of course is a good thing for climate change. But we have to also address the impacts on species. Now, for sub-Saharan Africa, the latest data I have, and it might have increased since this was published, say that renewable capacity has been expected to increase by 76% from 2021 to 2026. In addition, I think all of you know, reading the front pages of the newspapers or online, that because of some of the current developments in Europe involving Ukraine and the push now for countries to move away from oil and gas, there's a huge renewed attention to investing in renewable energy in Europe, as well as other parts of the world. So this is really a moment where we're going to see trillions of dollars being invested in a short time frame in renewable energy, and therefore we have to be at the table to do what we can to inform governments and investors and decision makers about how they can reduce impacts on biodiversity from renewable energy. So this is where the initiative that Rhiannon mentioned, which is called the CMS Energy Task Force, comes in. It is a very effective, very focused initiative that responds directly to these dual challenges of climate and biodiversity. It brings together governments as members, development banks. We now have the World Bank, we have the Asian Development Bank, we have the IFC, we have the European Development Bank, and many others. At the table, scientists, the private sector, civil society, to look at developing best practices and disseminating that information and the tools that are needed to do exactly what I described before, which is how do we support renewable energy deployment while minimizing impacts on migratory birds and bats and other species. We have about 40% of the members of ETF are countries are from Africa, which include Egypt, my companion to the left, and many others. The African Union is a member, and the African Sustainable Energy Association, and many others. So the good news is we are developing with this partnership, and I think you'll hear more about this later, real, practical, applicable tools for investment in renewable energy. This includes things like sensitivity mapping, looking at options for siting wind farms so that you can put them in places that are good for wind, but are also reducing the likelihood of interaction with migratory species. We've also shown and demonstrated through our work that the early consideration of migratory species and the possible impacts on them and avoiding those impacts is really beneficial to developers and investors in renewable energy and to governments. For example, it avoids costly and inefficient projects. It reduces the need for mitigation and restoration issues and compensation due to potential impacts. There can be major challenges from groups that protest and want to shut down wind farms that are impacting nature, and reduce public costs for recovery efforts. In terms, finally, of next steps, we have been growing and have new members. At our last meeting, we had several new members, including the World Bank, joining for the first time as a member. But we really need further broad and deep dissemination and uptake of the tools that we have so that that everyone involved in this business is aware of them. So we're talking about that literally. Today we had a conversation. How can we do that and make sure that there's awareness that there are solutions and it would be beneficial to all to apply them? One area I see is really needing attention is while we have the big development banks, we don't have the sovereign banks necessarily. So the national banks and also the private sector, the investors and the government officials that make decisions on renewable energy. So that's our challenge, is to get the information out there. There's also issues around knowledge gaps. For example, the number of studies there are on bird collisions with power lines, apparently it's pretty low in Africa compared to some other areas. So this is something we need to work on, is the knowledge base. And also expanding the geographic focus. We've done a fair amount of work in Africa and Europe. There's now interest, and in fact there's some exciting developments that are happening in Asia in that part of the world, which will be, there'll be in fact a launch next week for the Eastern and Australasian flyway. And finally, having more engagement of the private sector in this work is essential. So let me stop there. And again, I think where something makes sense to solve both of these issues, supporting renewable energy deployment, reducing impacts on species, which, as I'll talk about later, we don't even know all the value that they provide. It's a win-win-win, and we need to do this. So thank you very much, and look forward to the next panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. That was really great, to, setting the scene for us well and hearing more about the work of the CMS Energy Task Force. Looking forward to hearing more from you soon. But now I'm going to turn to Khaled. I just want to ask you your first question. Despite an increasing awareness and prioritization of biodiversity and climate concerns globally, there is significant lack of resource mobilization for nature-based solutions and nature-safe renewables. What do you see as your vision for the future, and what do you think about challenges Africa is facing to address and act to mitigate climate change through shifting to renewable energy and nature-based solutions?
Thank you, Rhiannon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amy, the rest of panel. Thanks, the audience, for attending this. So here, as I'm representing NCE, which is NGO in Egypt, when I hear the introduction by Rhiannon and the also the answer of the reply of Amy, this is the global concern. This is how the global society think of this challenge and see and address problems and state it. And now I think I'm here, and it will make more sense for me to address how this is being filtered down on a local level, on the ground, how this is being affecting people in everyday life. And to be honest, in most of the cases, I feel like we are in Africa in a position that we are forced to think within or react to a predefined concept that is already developed and became mature in a Western world or a Western society. What this means, the very nature and the meaning of nature conservation in Africa is very colonial, and this is not just my opinion. Many people talk about this, the colonial conservation that we inherited in African continent, and this can be defined easily as this is a model of biodiversity conservation that is built on a belief that the best approach of biodiversity conservation can be done by creating protected areas where ecosystem can function smoothly away from human interaction. And this is exactly what happened. A lot of African countries established protected areas are far from everyday's life of people. With time, governments and conservation organizations developed experience of natural resources management. But those experience in Africa, I argue, does not necessarily include the complexity of human nature reactions. I'll give some examples so that you understand what I say. So, CMS Convention is one of the most, from my opinion, active conventions working in biodiversity conservation. I feel this as working for nature conservation in Egypt. And Egypt has a very, very good story and leading experience in mitigating the negative impact of renewable energy infrastructure on biodiversity. But when we say on biodiversity, this is actually a very big word. I have to be precise, on birds, only on birds. And I have to be even more precise, on migratory birds. But this is not a fault of someone. This is because of the nature of Egypt. Egypt has one of the most important flyways, and most of the population of Egypt live on the Nile. Just 95% live in 4% of Egyptian area. So migration and renewable energy take place very far spatially from everyday life of people. then what we did is very valuable in Egypt for the planet. Of course, I believe in that. But it's not sufficient to have a good and balanced nature-human relationship in Egypt that the human being in Egypt feel in everyday life. Now, my concern in the future, if we continue this way, I think we are going to a position where, I'm actually having this now, for me to write a proposal for a future project, it's very easy to find evidence and knowledge on migratory species because this is what people fund mainly and this is what people do. But for resident birds that have very, very strong relation and high level of dependency in Egyptian life, we have very, very little research. So I'm hearing now what I hear, that Egypt need to react to the shortage of energy. But we have to react in a way that show our commitment to reduce the greenhouse gases. This is renewable energy. We will do this. We will grow. It will be very far from people's life, everyday life. And then we have very strong convention like CMS may bring us some fund to do more research. So it seems like we will be growing and having good experience only in one part of the picture, not everywhere. So I'm really looking forward to find somehow to mobilize some resources that makes us able to respond to everyday life demands and requirements and hopes of Egyptian population rather than only respond to global set agendas, which is, again, I'm not trying to say this is little or anything, but this is not enough, I believe. We have to respond locally. So, yeah, maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you. No, that is great to see your passion and enthusiasm as well as in how we can engage local people in Egypt going forward, and definitely looking forward to hearing more from you on that as we go around the questions. Going down to Charles, I'll ask you your first question. So, Charles, as we look ahead to COP27 and the global stocktake in 2023, governments need to seriously increase the ambition of their commitments in the update of their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. What do you see as the main needs and the role for civil society in holding governments to account over the next 6 to 12 months, and will it be enough?
So thank you so much, Madam Moderator, for this opportunity, and thank you everyone for coming for this important session. Now, about 7 years ago, the climate change enthusiasts and advocates were very excited in Paris, just here in Europe, because we thought we got a good document, the Paris Agreement. We thought that's a document that's progressive and that is going to provide solutions to the existential threat that's affecting human beings, and which is climate change. But one of the vehicles that was actually designed, to implement this very important document, of course, was the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. And national because every nation was assigned the responsibility of looking inwardly and checking to see what their commitment would be in reducing the greenhouse gases emissions that have brought us where we are. But what is interesting is the fact that even though countries were able to submit, their first round of NDCs, what we got, in terms of the commitments in those particular documents did not really reflect, the very spirit of the Paris Agreement. Why? Because on one side, in Africa, we got countries in Africa submitting highly ambitious NDCs, and whose implementation was really subject to availability of external resources. In other words, most of the NDCs in Africa really can only be implemented if there are resources and financial resources coming from outside, Africa. But then on the flip side of it again, from the north again, we got to see NDC commitments that were not really commensurate, to the level of emissions of the greenhouse gases in this side of the world. Africa only contributes a meager 4% to the total greenhouse gases emissions, which means if Africa was to bring it to zero in terms of the emissions, we are to achieve net zero, then of course that would only account for only 4%. And therefore, it was critical, or it still remains critical, to see a vision, to see serious commitments from where the 96% of the emissions is actually coming from. And that is key. If, for sure, the NDCs are going to make, a lot of sense, in this side of the world. But that has not been happening. Now, the second round of NDCs was actually supposed to be submitted by the end of 2020. Many countries didn't meet that deadline. Of course, the deadline was extended, but still, the first round of the NDCs was actually taking us towards a 3-degree, temperature rise trajectory. The current round of NDCs is still no better, because assuming we implement those NDCs 100%, then we are going to take a 2.7-degree trajectory. But we are talking about 1.5. And a few days ago, I think the day before yesterday, an expert from IPCC presented, some glaring figures, during the first Glasgow Dialogue meeting here, in the chamber here. And he indicated that at 1.1, we're already experiencing serious losses, serious damages, serious issues of loss of life, and both, of course, economic and non-economic, losses, emanating, of course, from only 1.1. Now, think about the 2.7, which can be actually presented by the new set of NDCs. So are we seriously in terms of how we are addressing, this particular challenge? I think the answer is no. But coming back home in Africa and talking about the NDCs that we submitted and that are highly conditional to availability of resources, how much of resources are flowing in the African continent, to support implementation at least of those particular NDCs. And I want to say we haven't been seeing a lot of resources coming that particular direction, and it is very, very important, really, to ensure that that is happening. But again, this also speaks to the question of technology transfer. Of course, in Africa, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to take a different development trajectory. And that opportunity must actually be seized. We must be able to take that particular opportunity, but support Africa really to take that trajectory of going the renewable way. Of course, we take pride in the fact that most of the countries in Africa really experience sunshine for the longest period. We don't have cases of winter and so on and so forth. And therefore, we still have sunlight that can actually be tapped. But you see, sunlight can only become a resource only if technologies are availed or they are available for us to be able to tap that. We have situations where we're able to, tap, with energy. We have issues of geothermal, for example. In Kenya, for example, we have not even tapped 10% of geothermal potential, in Kenya. In other words, there is great potential in Africa, but resources are needed, technologies are needed, and therefore, whenever we're talking about technology transfer, really, I think it's something that should be taken very seriously. Now, in terms of the CSO's engagement in the whole discourse, I want to say that there is a critical role that the civil societies must play in terms of keeping the government on their toes, in terms of tracking implementation, not just from Africa, but also from other regions. And therefore, as members of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, we developed a tool that we are calling the Ndc Tracking Tool. And that tracking tool, from this year, we are training civil societies in Africa. We are training even government officials themselves, because they also need to track themselves and check to see how they are faring in terms of implementation of the NDCs. We must hold governments accountable. We must hold each other accountable if we are serious about really, moving towards 1.5, but not towards 2.7 that is presented, or the current scenario presented by the current NDCs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charles. That was great to hear how you're working to hold governments to account and working with them to hold themselves to account. Ephraim, do you want to come and take the stage and join us? Thank you for fitting us in your very busy schedule. Looking forward to having an intervention from you. So just while he's joining us, I'm going to provide a short introduction. So for those that don't know, sorry, just going to get my notes up. Ephraim is the chair of the African Negotiating Group of Climate Change, also the Director of Climate Change and Natural Resources for the Republic of Zambia. And you also served as Zambia's focal point under the CBD, as well as on the IPCC. So we know you're well qualified to engage in this panel today. You're clearly an expert on climate change policy and practice, with experience spanning over 15 years in both policy formulation, implementation, as well as climate change negotiations under the UNFCCC process. You've worked for the Zambian government on environmental issues for over 18 years, with short breaks on secondment to the Climate Change Facilitation Unit from 2009 to 2012, supported by UNDP, and also coordinating the African Regional Climate Change Adaptation Initiative with WWF. So we're looking forward to hearing from you today, and I'm going to ask you a question and hope that you can respond. Looking forward to hearing from your significant experience. So just want to ask you, so as you're aware, Africans' population is growing rapidly and its energy needs with it in the face of increasing climate change impacts and threats to biodiversity and food security. What do you see as the key issues, solutions and opportunities at the international level in the run-up to Africa's COP27 to support transformative adaptation and energy actions for an equitable, nature-positive and carbon-neutral future in Africa? There we go.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, let me apologize for joining a bit late. As you may know, the global stock take is a big agenda here, and it's just taking place in the chamber hall, the room next to here, and to make a statement before coming to join. On the question posed, probably I would start with population dynamics. I think Africa's population may not really be the problem or the challenge, because I think the continent, as you know, is quite vast, and in terms of its carrying capacity, its potential carrying capacity is still quite available. And in terms of its growth, I think most of us believe that Africa's population actually is supposed to be a dividend that helps it to develop, particularly the young generation, if well resourced and equipped. But the question is legitimate in the circumstances that we face now, like when you refer to energy in terms of connectivity on the continent is very low. A lot of households are still using traditional cooking methods. They rely on not even charcoal, but fuel, wood, and all that. So yes, from that perspective, it is a challenge that requires to be addressed. And we are going into COP27 in a situation where countries are being requested to transition in terms of their energy systems to move. And so it provides a great opportunity for us in terms of Africa to take advantage of this, to transition into renewable energies and ensure that Africa can shift from this unsustainable energy use into sustainable energy, which would spur development, because the availability of energy is a catalyst to development. But also the other impacts of climate change specifically that Africa faces, particularly on food security and all that, we think would be resolved quite significantly with lightening up Africa with energy across, because then you'd stimulate irrigation, for example, and you'd ensure that the production of food would be done in most of the countries all year round, and that would be a significant. And that's something that would even help address the perceived population challenge that Africa faces, because you would stop or at least reduce food imports, for example. Africa is not supposed to be importing any food with the vast land that it has and water availability. So technology is critical to that, and particularly in the energy sector. But we're also looking at COP27 as a COP that should be transformative, particularly on adaptation, because I think if you look across the spectrum in terms of addressing climate change, what we've done so far over the last number of years is that we have focused a lot on mitigation, which is important. It is critical that's the ultimate solution to the challenge of climate change, is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But we cannot give a blind eye to what is already happening, the impacts that countries are experiencing. If you look at the flooding that occurred in Durban, for example, in a very few days you lose more than 500 lives unaccounted for. And we are here debating loss and damage. Those are some of the clear pictures of how climate change is ravaging the continent and countries. And so, obviously, having a COP in Africa, you would not ignore those realities. And you find that adaptation is most likely to be key in terms of consideration of what needs to be done, because it's a priority to the continent. And of course, achieving goals, whether it is our mitigation goals of limiting global warming and ensuring that I found my colleague just outlining how we are off track in terms of the trajectory to 1.5 degrees and what needs to be done if we are to achieve that. That also requires that we transform some of the practices if it is on the African continent. When you look at the emission profiles of most of the countries, it's largely emissions from land use. And what that means, it's the practices of our agricultural systems, our forest management systems, and all that needs to be addressed so that they can become more sustainable. And all that calls for technology. When you talk of increasing agricultural productivity per hectare, for example, you would need technologies that would ensure efficient use of the land and water, but also ensuring that we are able to provide food security. So I think the priorities in terms of the conference on the African soil will be quite closely to the development dynamics and the challenges that Africa faces, because the two are quite interlinked. I think for now I would stop here, and probably if there is a chance for questions, we can elaborate on those. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. And again, thank you for fitting us in the Global Stocktake technical dialogues. I know it's a very busy time. Just a quick follow-up question for you, because I know you'll need to leave again shortly. What do you see that needs to be happen from behalf of the Africa Group of Negotiators to make this a truly African COP delivered by the Egyptian presidency?
Well, we are very careful, of course, when we talk of the African COP. I think it is, maybe this needs to be understood. We are referring to it happening in Africa, but this is a multilateral process, and we have all the regions have a stake in advancing work in terms of the conference. So maybe when you hear us or in other circles emphasizing that this is an African COP, it's just an understanding that it's a COP that is happening in Africa. It won't change the principles of the Convention, of the Paris Agreement, and the issues that we have on the agenda, which of course have to address all regions across the board. But it's when you look at reports, for example, the recent IPCC reports that have come out, particularly the second, the Working Group 2 report, which is looking at the impacts across the regions, and it tells you that Africa will be the most impacted region in the world in terms of climate change, because that's a real scientific finding that we can't run away from. So I just wanted to put that context in terms of but I think what is key is the COP27 success depends a lot on what happens here. As you know, this is where we are laying the groundwork, where the draft decisions on a lot of critical issues have to be done and everything refined. Because at the COP, when you arrive at the COP, you basically just have 1 week to do technical work. In the second week, you have our ministers joining, you go into the high-level segment, and that becomes largely ceremonial. Not a lot of technical work is done. But now with the arrangement that we are having, actually even the first 2 days, the World Leaders Summit will be beginning like we did in Glasgow. So you find that a lot of technical work time for technical work is significantly reduced, which is why we need to achieve most of the deliverables here, so that when we go to Glasgow, we are just winding up and reporting to the ministerial and high-level segments for adoption. So it's the maximum use of time while we are here, which will be critical and which will determine the outcome in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I know that you're working hard to make sure that we do that groundwork here while we're in Bonn, so that when we go into Sharm el-Sheikh in November, that hopefully we, as you say, we can do the maximum benefit from the time that we have there. So thank you for that response. Do you have time to stay for a bit long?
Well, if there is a question.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we return back to the other panelists, is there any questions from the audience that we would like to ask of Ephraim directly? No? Nothing on the virtual platform? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Very much appreciate it. So now return back to our other panelists. And Charles, just to follow on from Ephraim, I might ask you the same question. So looking forward to November, what are your expectations for the outcomes, challenges and opportunities for COP27? And what are PACT's objectives and what you want to see achieved and from the Egyptian presidency?
Thank you so much. And it's good we had the chair of the African Group of Negotiators, because we work very closely with the AGN, in terms of also communicating the civil society position and views, so that can also be articulated on the floor, because civil societies, as you know, we don't participate in the negotiations on the floor, but we're able to influence, through the laid out, structures. I want to mention that we left Glasgow last year a disappointed people, because COP26 did not live up to the expectation of the African people. Remember, there were views that COP26 was really supposed to be held virtually, and I remember PACJA was among the civil society organizations that pushed really for a physical COP. Because when we are talking about the issue of more than 600 million people in Africa not having access to electricity, we could not understand how then those 600 million people would be able to participate and follow the COP negotiations virtually, because of the challenges, of course, that are experienced in Africa. And when we were at Glasgow, we had a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister from Egypt, because we wanted to start the engagement right from there. And that is why the AGN chair, of course, said that this is not an African COP, but civil societies, we are calling it the African People's COP. Why? Because we believe it carries really the hope of the African people, now that it's happening in the African soil. And I want to mention that immediately after Glasgow, we negotiated with the government of Egypt, and we carried out a major stakeholders forum in Cairo in December last year, to sit together and think about a strategy of engagement going forward towards the African People's COP. And I want to say that as a result of that, we were able to come up with a strategy that we were able to communicate during the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, and also during the African Regional Conference on Sustainable Development in Kigali. And the same will be negotiated again, during CHOGM, Commonwealth Heads of State and Governments meeting happening in Kigali. And the thing is, now that particular strategy is what we're using really to engage stakeholders towards an African People's COP heading to Sharm el-Sheikh. But I want to mention that there are several things that as civil society we are pushing for. One, we are still pushing for the special circumstances for Africa. And this is not based on rhetoric, but it's based on IPCC data that was quoted by the AGN chair, that Africa really is on the verge of collapse. If the temperature rise, of course, continue on that particular trajectory. We're experiencing cases of cyclones. In April, we had a major loss and damage conference in Malawi. And you should have seen the women on the podium crying and breaking, trying to narrate the stories about how they have lost their livelihoods, how they have lost their loved ones, and of course, recently what happened in KwaZulu-Natal, in South Africa. So these are real things, these are real manifestations of damages that are emanating from climate of change. And we are saying that Africa has been pushing for recognition as a region with special needs and circumstances. This has never been granted. I don't know whether we lost it in 2015 during the Paris Agreement, when probably that issue was not put in our agenda, but we're still pushing for that. I think it is still something that we're still pushing for. Number two, we are pushing for a special facility for loss and damage. What we are seeing here in terms of the negotiations around the Glasgow, dialogue, really doesn't have a lot of structures, really. We are just like discussing. It's almost like a therapy session, sharing about our situation and what we have been experiencing. But we need some structured way of negotiating this particular issue. And we cannot say that adaptation fund is going to cover, for losses and damage. We are saying it's important for us to come up with a facility that will be able to achieve that. And let's deviate from the question of discussing insurance. You cannot burn my house and sell a fire extinguisher to me. That is the analogy that I want to use. We have to have a facility that will be accessed in form of grants to support the families and communities that are actually at the front line of the climate crisis. Number three, global goal for adaptation. That is something that we're still pushing for. And we are glad that discussion is already taking place here, at SB 56. But we hope we can have actually come up, with a clear, mechanism of basically coming up with a goal or a global goal for adaptation. My view, the African adaptation needs are more than mitigation needs. Adaptation is a necessity, and we cannot avoid it because the impacts are already visible. We are already experiencing it, so you have no choice but to adapt. Mitigation presents an opportunity, of course, for us to take a low carbon development trajectory, and therefore, the 25-75 ratio in terms of allocation of resources or climate finance, 75 going to mitigation and 25 going to adaptation, does not make a lot of sense to us in Africa. And therefore, we are pushing for at least 50-50 balance between adaptation and mitigation, finances, within the continent. I think I want to just mention those few. Probably can engage more on others.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really clear to see that the priorities that PACT are asking for going into COP27, and I think it's clear that there is a role for nature-safe adaptation and nature-safe mitigation in delivering that for Africa. So it'd be great to continue to work together so we can make sure we can deliver this within your ask that you're calling for from COP27 and the stakeholders involved. So Amy and Khaled, I'm going to now turn back to you and ask you the same question to get your different perspectives. So I'll start with you, Amy, if that's okay. So Amy, how can we mainstream and raise the profile of nature-based solutions and nature-safe renewables that we've talked about, especially what the CMS ETF can deliver across multi-stakeholder groups, including governments, investors, and developers in Africa to deliver on the transformative change clearly needed?
Okay, thank you for that question, and it's been very interesting to listen to the other panelists and putting this in the context of the broader context of the negotiations and the needs and the impacts. In fact, I was just looking at that IPCC report and reminding myself of some of the conclusions, including for Africa. As we've heard, some of the impacts are being felt now, as the report concludes. The first thing I'll say is that, I am currently working in the sphere of biodiversity. Climate change and biodiversity loss go hand in hand. I mean, the issues of addressing biodiversity and addressing climate change. And, you spoke earlier of silos, and of course, the way that the international community has approached these two issues has been in a bit of a silo. But the fact is, in the natural world, it's an integrated system. And so we have to think that way. And the fact that we haven't caught up about that in our policy making doesn't mean that that they're not related, and therefore we have to address them as a whole. So that's the first point. The second is, we need to also, we don't even know yet, and we will never have perfect data about the value of nature to many things, including, human benefits, mitigating climate change, and climate resilience. And I'll just give you an example, which when I first heard about it, I thought, this is crazy, but there's this IMF economist who's been doing some papers and actually did some valuation for carbon sequestration abilities of certain migratory species. And he looked first at whales, and then he looked at the forest elephant in Central Africa. And he found that he gave an estimate that each forest elephant can sequester carbon to make it valued at about $1.75 million for its lifetime. And that's just using the current population of elephants. If we can recover and strengthen the population of those elephants, there'll be more opportunities for carbon sequestration because of what that elephant does in its life in the ecosystem. To basically what it does is it goes through the forest and will suppress small brush so that major trees can grow that can sequester carbon. So if you take away the elephant, you lose that benefit. And this has been documented in other ecosystems. If you remove certain key species, it has an impact on the resilience of the ecosystem to address not only biodiversity, water supply, climate resilience, climate mitigation. So we need to consider nature and its value even if we don't know precisely all of the benefits that we get. The third point is, I said it earlier, but just to repeat it, because it's really critical, which is we need to get the solutions that we provide in the Energy Task Force into the hands of decision makers and investors. This is absolutely critical because we could have beautiful guidelines sitting up there on a shelf. That doesn't help very much. We need to get the word out and get it again into the hands of sovereign banks, national banks, private sector, etc. Another point is, the World Bank and the World Bank Group and really the development banks around the world have redone their standards for strategic environment assessment and environmental impact assessment, which applies to projects, to better reflect impacts on biodiversity. But they still don't necessarily get to the level of species and migratory species. So again, ensuring that the data, the evidence is being brought in so that we don't omit the value of these species. It's critically important that those tools are done with the information that we now have. I also want to note that, again, in terms of information tools, I just want to note a major development that we just launched in CMS 2 weeks ago, which it's 100 years of data on birds. Now, a lot of the birds in the African Eurasian flyway, they'll come up from Africa and move across actually the Gulf of Naples in Italy and up into Europe and across to Eastern Europe for their breeding season. And we just launched an atlas, which is online, it's free, it's available. You can find it on our website, which is cms.int. And essentially it shows for 300 species of birds their migration patterns. So you can visualize it, you can see where they are. And that's important not only for planning purposes, but also because it really sheds a light, I think, for the self-interest of countries to say, if we want to protect birds and have those birds come back to us every year, our birds, we have to make sure they're protected elsewhere. So if you're a country, let's say in Europe, and you want to ensure that there's conservation of those birds, you also have to think about what's happening in Africa. And so if you're thinking about the wind investment, you need to think about it across the entire flyway. So it's not good enough if there's attention to this only in some countries. It has to be done across the whole range that these animals travel. So there's self-interest, and that's where CMS also comes in for my last point, which is that's exactly why we exist, is we provide a platform for countries to come together who share species and are trying to come up with agreed approaches for the conservation of species that are in their countries. So it's a way that countries can come together and exchange these tools, apply them, and ensure that, again, there's protection across the entire range. I think with that, yes, I think I'll close with that, and I look forward to my colleagues' response as well.
Thank you, Emmy. Yeah, that was very nice to hear. Actually, when I hear the word nature-based solution and mainstreaming, and yes, they are very well promoted now. No one now is doubting or questioning whether they are necessary or not. People, I think, at least this is what I feel, at least in Egypt, people are convinced, they are fully supporting. But I think we need to emphasize more on what do we mean exactly. So if we're talking about mainstreaming, what's the definition of mainstreaming? How much mainstreaming is enough? How much is too much? What we do is sufficient or not? So, and also the same with the nature-based solution. To be honest, I was really struggling. I'm still struggling to understand what do we really mean about nature-based solution. You could read definitions by IUCN, like those are actions, yeah, to protect, to sustainably manage, to restore natural resources, to adapt, to protect or to respond positively to a societal challenge. But then you read about the examples of this, and this vary from forest restoration until some green roofs. So to take an example and implement it in Egypt, it doesn't seem like I have a lot of relevant examples that I can think of in my mind. And also restoration and mainstreaming somehow get very closely related on the ground when it comes to implementation. And I will give an example. Again, this very successful story of wind farms and the associated mainstreaming of biodiversity. It looks at, as I said, birds only, but we know from our research on the ground that also some wind farms were responsible for damaging some very fragile habitat of an endangered reptile species. But this is not popping in the radar of anyone. No one sees this. Also, if we go to the other sector of renewable energy, we have a huge farm of solar energy production in Aswan, and it was investigated deeply, and there is no much wildlife around that place, just huge panels in the middle of the desert, and it seems this is not affecting anything. But to build this station, they had to build bridge to connect west of the Nile to east of the Nile to facilitate transportation of expertise and equipment and all of that. And this bridge had to land some columns on some islands of the Nile where wintering birds spend winter, where farmers take their livestock and get them loose there for grazing. And this is, again, this is an impact because of renewable energy production. And it's directly harming nature, but it's not popping on the radar of either the government, and I'm not blaming the government nor the civil society who works in this, but because of my first intervention, we inherited to adopt a colonial way of what is nature and where is nature and what to protect as a priority and what is not. So we learned to give less attention to such damages. So we look at migratory birds. We look at big species, like iconic species, who make us feel better or whatsoever. So I'm concerned with all of that when it comes to the practicality of implementation and how this means eventually on the ground. Because if we're talking, we are here just to make our life better. humans' life better. And if what we do is trying to convince each other in rooms like this that we are doing fine, and we have evidence, but I think we have always to question our evidence, that they should not be just convincing to us here, but also convincing to people on the ground. This is very important.
Yeah, thank you, Khaled. That, it's very clear what we need to do. And I believe Amy wants to come back with a quick response.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, and for letting me take the floor again, because I now remember a point I wanted to make to Khaled's earlier point, and that he's just also made, which is the reason CMS exists, and it's about migratory birds, is because it's meant to address just that countries can't solve the problem of conservation of birds that leave their country without working with other countries. So we don't get into the resident species at CMS, but other entities do. And it doesn't mean that, and also a lot of the solutions that we bring also do benefit resident species. But our focus is our mandate is on species that cross a border, at least one border, because that's the core of the cooperation we need to bring. But for example, the Convention of Biological Diversity, regional conventions deal with the species across the board. So I just wanted to clarify that and why our focus is what it is.
Yes, Amy, thank you very much. This is totally understood. I really, truly, sincerely, I admire what you do in the convention, honestly. But I'm here just trying to transfer the response that we get from people on the ground. We are being accused in NCE, and yet many international organizations look at us in NCE, and they value our work. They see what we do, and we are very glad. We are honored to feel appreciated. But on the ground, we are being asked what you do, and when we explain what we do, people feel like this is not relevant. Yeah, okay, if you protect white storks on the, like somewhere on the Red Sea, and okay, good for you, good for the white stork, but what did you provide for me here in the Nile Valley, where I live? So, and this is not someone's mistake, as I said. This is just a concern, a national concern that we are dealing with this clearly, and we are trying to take actions to solve it. But also, it's very important to make clear that we are here touching the issue of renewable energy, which I think the very short history in the last 10 years, this is my worries, that somehow made us think of the impact of renewable energy only on migratory species because of the very active role of CMS. So I'm just worried that this becomes the only language we are speaking. This is just my concern. This is what I'm trying to emphasize. We need to dig more, because the impact of infrastructure of renewable energy in Africa is huge and multidimensional and very complex, and it needs to be very well investigated. So that's my message. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, Khaled. And I think from across our 4 panelists today, it's been very clear that the climate, people, energy, nature agendas is just so complex and really needs to be looked at together to make the biggest difference. I now want to open it up to the floor for the remaining time within our session today. And for those watching virtually on the platform, you can also type your questions into the chat and we will ask them out to the panelists. But yes, if anyone wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. We've got some mobile microphones. People will bring them to you. Any questions to our panelists or on the virtual platform? Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, mine is not a question, but just to add to what Chester said, coming from the African background and 100% African, the COP, we see a lot of issues that affect us. And when he was talking, he talked about the issues of loss and damage, which what you see is that it's mostly women and children that are affected by this. We're also looking at the issues of financing mechanism. We, as AGM, I'm a member of the AGM. I'm sorry, I missed what the AGM chair was saying, his presentation. But as a gender focal person for my country, Nigeria, we are looking at, of course, the work plan, Lima work plan, the enhanced program. How can we bring in the issue of strengthening the gender national focal persons to be able to address and work with the other gender actors or feminists in their various countries? But how about the financing mechanism? How is this thing impacting on the women or the gender group across the continent? These are some of the key issues that we are looking at, and we want to see it happen in COP27. Enough of the talk, we want to see the actions, and I like what you said, that we are here talking to ourselves. How has this thing translated to the people on the ground, the people who are feeling the most impact of climate change? How are we relating with them? How are we bringing them to the table to discuss? How are we feeling their pains? These are issues that we want to see discussed, and not in rooms like this, but let actions take place at the grassroots. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a really great statement to the panel. Charles, I'm not sure if you would like to maybe briefly comment on that.
Well, that's a comment from my sister Priscilla, so I may not necessarily have a lot of things to add to the same, but just to concur with her. But of course, everything boils down into how are we funding all these mechanisms and all these plans we are coming up with, because we discuss things and we come up with the plans, but when it comes now to financing that, activating that, it becomes a big problem. And right now we are discussing the Santiago network, for example, the structure, how is it going to operate and all that. But in the long run, what we need is really a facility, for example, to have loss and damage, for example. So I think the finance question is a big question that we really must actually be able to address. Now, the 100 billion commitment, where is the money? The thing is, where is the money to be able to probably run, the activities that money was actually supposed to, to go to. Look at what is happening within GCA, for example. Now, for the communities at the front line of the crisis to access, and the women that she's talking about, those ones that are affected by climate change, for them to access those resources through their small CBOs or community-based institutions, it's almost impossible. When you ask for bankable proposals and putting very stringent measures for you to be able to achieve or to be able to access those resources, it becomes very difficult for the women, at the front line, for example. When resources also come through in form of loans, we put African governments into more deeper, that particular challenges and all that. So we are saying resources must be available for us to be able to implement all this. Thank you.
Good, we've got some more hands up. I'm just going to go to this person in the front. Yeah, Tillman, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Atai from PAMAC. And it's unfortunate that the AGN chair is not here because part of my question is directed to him and then to Charles. This is largely because I do not in any way, I do not feel comfortable with terminological inexactitudes. And what I mean by that is that he tried to tell us that when we say it's an African COP, it is not that it's a COP for Africa, it means that it's a COP that is taking place in Africa. And so that means that the multilateral processes and every other thing will go on. And then some other persons tell us that it's an African COP because it's a COP that will put on the front burner issues that relate to Africa more than any other continent. And then Charles said that we say that it's an African People's COP. And in this space, we have the capacity to generate and through new words and terminologies at each twist and turn, perhaps at the end, we obfuscate meaning. Can you explain more on the difference between an African People's Corp and an African Corp, and then perhaps from the perspective of the AGN chair? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atai, Babs, on the issue of terminologies. I think what the chair said, he said that this is not an African Corp per se, as in it's not really just the African People's Corp per se, in the literal meaning of the words, because of course there are other parties, involved, of course, in the negotiations. But I'm saying from the civil society point of view, we are saying that this is the Corp that carries the African people's, aspirations. And therefore, we are calling it not the African Corp, but we're calling it the African People's Corp, meaning that we have an opportunity, because it's happening in the African soil, to articulate our issues. And rightfully so, because, like we mentioned, and like data, confirms that Africa is one of the regions really most affected by the climate crisis. The thing is, we want to raise, the impetus and the profile of this particular COP, so that we can actually be able to see whether the hope for the African people will actually be addressed, through a COP that is happening in the African soil.
Yeah, thank you, Charles.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, actually, I have a question for you as well, Charles, and the panelists as well. As a negotiator point of view, I always have this on my mind, like, let's assume that you have been attending many COPs since last years, and you are having targets now. For instance, you are targeting to have 50-50 adaptation mitigation balance in Africa. So, like, did you really notice any actual improvement in the last COPs? Did you think that we already reached any improvement until now, or we will keep discussing and putting new hopes and dreams in our agenda? So I would love to really get a set of evidence about the past and current negotiation achievements.
I want to respond by saying that we are only scratching the surface. The adaptation needs for the African continent, and indeed for the developing nations, is way, way, way too high. I know there's been the whole question about how can we quantify really, adaptation needs, for the continent. But for sure, the African governments have been really allocating a lot of resources, knowingly or otherwise, in terms of addressing, adaptation needs, of their people. Be it in terms of struggling to supply water to the regions that are that need water, be it the question of maybe supporting the farmers, especially in irrigation and those other farm improvements that are needed really for them to be able to continue producing food. A lot of investment have been going through, the African governments themselves. Now, the reason as why we have a big, disparity, between money going to adaptation and mitigation is because mitigation is about sale of technologies. And that is more attractive to investors than it is, to invest in adaptation itself. And therefore, we are saying we need to think about it. We need to think about adaptation being a necessity for the African people. Because we have no choice. When the rain has beaten you, you just have to look for an umbrella. There's no choice about it. But we are saying mitigation is good, but it provides us with an opportunity for us to take a different development trajectory. But we are saying let's not ignore what is needed most, which is adaptation for the African people.
Thank you, Charles, for that. We've just got a question on our virtual platform. If you'd be happy to read that out.
Yes, exactly. It's rather a comment than a question. So it's from Naima Eriyahi. Hello, and thank you to all the panelists and to the coordinator. I do not have a question, but an opinion about why people do not care about all the work which we're trying to do. It is because we need to work with indigenous people and their knowledge. People have coexisted with animals and birds and plants for centuries, and they have ancestral knowledge that can help fight the climate change. And we need to work with communities and not exclude them when making policies. Thank you. So that was a comment from the online chat.
No, thank you for that. Would any of our panelists like to respond? Amy or Khaled?
No, I want to say that I agree that, you can't, all action really at the end of the day is local. I mean, you can't have successful conservation without local engagement and the people who live where the action is. And, so we can agree on global goals, but at the end of the day, the action is not happening, in the offices in the UN, it's happening within countries, in particular with conservation, it's happening on the ground. And therefore, actually, I really also appreciate Khaled's additional comment about, because it's something I struggle with a lot in trying to convey, why is this important? This is why should people care about saving this species or convincing people that climate change is a real issue. This is a communications issue. It's trying to link the importance of what all of us are working on to someone in their everyday life. And, our main target is to governments and to, policy people who are making decisions. So that's the sphere that I'm working in. But within a country, this is where national governments, local governments, and engagement with local communities is so, so important. So, you're not only addressing certain species or issues, but that's where bringing all of the work and all of the various, obligations of countries and issues that are going on into the context of the country and the local community is absolutely vital.
Yes, of course, I totally agree with this, and this is exactly what I'm trying to say in maybe in a different way, but also maybe something to say. And here I'm not trying to be nice or diplomatic, but this is reality because of the fact that Egypt is hosting the next COP. For the first time, actually, the NCE is having very, very close contact with the Minister of Environment, and we were able to share all of our concerns and interest, and we were welcomed and invited actually to participate in different level of policy making and decision making, and this is only because of hosting the COP, really. And I do see this as a hope. I do see this as somehow empowering African community because of hosting this COP. I do see it from my perspective as an African COP somehow in the meaning that it gave more priority to African related problems. It gave us more platform to raise our voice and to express what really matters for Egyptian and African communities, of course. So in this sense, I think it's very, very useful, and I believe it will provide a good push forward for conservation actions and climate change related actions on the ground, just hosting it in Africa.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think just looking at the time, unless there are any other final quick questions from the floor, I think that's actually a really nice note to end on. Any final questions? No? I'm just going to take a few quick minutes then to wrap up. I think it's been, as I mentioned, very clear that from our panelists today, the intersects between nature, climate, energy, and people are really apparent in how we're addressing some of these issues, and especially in the geopolitical context of acceleration of renewable energies going on at the moment, felt in Europe and around the world, for one, to both mitigate climate change impacts, but also the other, decoupling from oil and gas, which we know needs to happen regardless. But I think it's clear that COP27 will allow Africa to showcase leadership in its transformative action to deliver impactful adaptation interventions and a just transition to nature-safe, renewable energy access pathways. So ending on that, our hosts of our event today, WWF and BirdLife International, would like to thank you all for coming, and definitely a big thank you to our 4 panelists who have taken the time out of their busy agendas to participate today and share their perspectives. We're very grateful. If anyone does want to look back on the recording of this, it will be up on the UNFCCC's YouTube channel. There was a lot of content covered today, some really good points, especially, from our quick visit of our AGN chair coming in off the intervention floor. So again, if you'd like to join me in thanking our panelists, I'd be grateful.
I don't know where we put these now. Maybe with our technical colleagues. Yeah.